I feel like I should be playing some elevator music or something. Okay, it's about 3 minutes after, so I'd like to go ahead and for us to get started. Good evening, I am Judy Zombrecker, and I'm co-president of the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts. And I'd like to welcome everyone to our second webinar in our series commemorating the League's 100th anniversary. This evening, Dr. Carolyn Jefferson-Jenkins joins us to discuss her book, The Untold Story of Women of Color in the League of Women Voters. Dr. Jefferson-Jenkins joined the League in 1982 and has held many leadership positions leading up to serving as the 15th president of the League, the U.S. League, and chair of the League of Women Voters Education Fund from 1998 to 2002. She is the only woman of African American descent to head the League. This evening, Dr. Jefferson-Jenkins will discuss her book, and following the presentation, we'll have a discussion where we can delve into further understand the history of the League and women of color in it, and how we can apply our understanding and learning from this history to become a more inclusive League and to positively influence what we do over our next 100 years to be an effective, relevant part of our nation. And with that, I'd like to turn the screen over to Dr. Jefferson-Jenkins.
Thank you, Judy, and good evening to those of you who have joined us in this second webinar of this, what I consider an invaluable series. I always think that when I am giving remarks, I'm adding color to the conversation. So thank you, Judy, for mentioning the need for inclusivity and diversity. I want to thank those of you on the call for allowing us into your homes, into your quarantine spaces. By the number of people who are participating, it appears that some of you are in need of a distraction from the current situation. So thank you for joining us. I want to say that I am honored to be a part of this, and that the stories of women of color that I will be sharing with you this evening deserve more than a footnote in the history of the League of Women Voters. So to those of you who are concerned that by continuing our conversation about celebrating, we're being self-serving in the midst of everything that's going on, we are not. We learn valuable lessons from history, and there were lessons to be learned from the history of the League and how the League engaged with its members of color. Suffice it to say, we live in interesting times, times in which race and gender are still at the forefront of all of our conversations in society and in our most sacred institutions. As the nation celebrates the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, much attention is given to organizations that serve as the foundation. The League of Women Voters is the legacy organization for the suffrage movement. So on February 14th, when we celebrated our 100th anniversary, we prepared many publications. We've talked about our history. We've talked about how this is a grassroots organization. We talked about the historic role in women's suffrage. But what we did not talk about in any substantive way was the role of women of color. Although I have been quite encouraged recently by the conversations shifting. And so there are more and more people who are bringing attention to women of color. So as we go through this evening, I want to do three things. I want to give some context to the conversation that I want to move you to. I want to make sure that we talk about the substance and the structure and focus of the book for those of you who have already read it and for those of you who are considering reading it. We're going to have a question and answer session, and then I'll go back to Judy, the co-president, who will give you some closing remarks. So again, I want to thank Judy and her team for making sure that this part of the conversation is not left behind. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to get some information, we're going to do some illumination, some inspiration, and some motivation. As I thought about the 100th anniversary of the founding of the League of Women Voters, I wondered what I could do to help ensure that this organization, to which I share pride and accomplishments, lives up to its principles, changes with the times, and remains the voice for citizens and force for change that it envisions itself to be. So I decided to write this book, realizing that we, League members, can better understand and appreciate ourselves if we know the story of all of the women who made significant contributions to the history of the League. As we know, the capacity to tell stories is what keeps history alive. This 100th anniversary is the perfect opportunity to bring to life the untold story of the contributions of women of color and to move this story from the footnotes and into the mainstream history. Now, I need to offer a caveat because adding the stories of the unique challenges of League members of color does not take away from anyone else's story. I hope that this untold story evokes in you some deep emotion, some sadness, some wonder, and possibly some joy. I hope it helps young people see the value of belonging to organizations that may not initially appear inviting. I've had a great experience in the League, and through this account of history, I want to honor the organization that I love, but tell its unabridged story. It took me years of research in the Library of Congress, in the League of Women Voters U.S. archives, through telephone conversations with former members, interviews, letters, to come to the conclusions that are made in the book. The interesting thing is that the richness of the League's history still resides in the local and state archives. And I would like to challenge you to go ahead and start doing your own research. There are many states who have already started this, but we need to do our own research in each of the states. I liken it to the Encyclopedia Britannica. If we were to do the history of each state, we would have volumes like there would be in an encyclopedia. So the message that I'm leaving you with is, we are more than a footnote. So why this story and why now? Taylor, if you will change the slide, please. Why now? Because it's time. The history that many portray during the centennial is a romanticized and sanitized version of accomplishments and achievements, the things we are most proud of, mentioning challenges only in the context of external confrontations to our activities or issues. Our representation is similar to taking a selfie, using filters, getting the right angle, the right lighting. But the true story of the suffrage movement and its legacy organization, the League of Women Voters, is a complicated story of controversy and compromise, of soaring achievements and striking flaws, of strategic choices and recurrent themes, of constant tension between practicality and principle. We live with the truism that we want our heroes to be perfect, but history reminds us that they are just people. The unabridged history is complicated, it's messy, it's uncomfortable, and sometimes unbelievable on the issues of race. But to be true to its principles, it is imperative that the organization's history, as recounted in its 2020 commemorations, acknowledges this inequity. From acknowledging these unpleasant truths can come a brighter future. It's also fortuitous that the League's anniversary occurs during Black History Month because this is also the year that marks the 150th anniversary of the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which granted Black men suffrage and caused a monumental rift in the suffrage movement. So I'm here tonight to remind you that the League of Women Voters was born from the struggle for the right to vote for women. Women of color were there too from the beginning, but for them, the ratification of the 19th Amendment was not the universal celebration it was reported to be. Winning the vote for women required 72 years of advocacy, but for most women of color, it required an additional 45 years with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Hundreds of women of color made commendable contributions to the women's suffrage movement, and to the League of Women Voters, many of whom you may never know because their involvement has been overlooked. We need to put a human face on what to many may be abstract. So the photo that we're looking at tells a powerful story, and we use it in all of our commemorations. It's the image that we have chosen to represent us. What story is it telling? And what story isn't it telling? It's not telling a complete story because it doesn't reflect the hard decisions that were made, the complexity of the conversations that took place. So I was not surprised to read the New York Times editorial in 2018 that was entitled "The Racism Behind Women's Suffrage." I was pleasantly surprised, however, when Chris Carson, our national president, and Virginia Case, CEO, wrote a response on behalf of the League, both acknowledging our shortcomings and pledging to do better. Some excerpts from the editorial add a missing dimension to the story of this photo. And I quote, "Its worst offenses may be that it rendered nearly invisible the Black women who labored in the suffrage vineyard, and that it looked away from the racism that tightened the grip on the fights for women's vote in the years after the Civil War, and selling out the interest of African-American women when it became politically expedient to do so. This betrayal of trust opened a rift between Black and white feminists that persists to this day. Historians are rightly warning groups involved in suffrage commemorations not to overstate the significance of the 19th Amendment. It covered the needs of middle-class white women quite nicely, but it meant very little to Black women in the South, where most lived. Organizers need to keep that in mind as they commemorate a movement in which racism clearly played a central role," unquote. The other interesting thing that stems from this photo is the suffrage commemorative coin design. And I had the opportunity to look at that on the US Mint website. What I found quite interesting was that there is a representation of a woman of color, but on her hat is a pin that says 1920. And we need to rethink that because 1920 would not have meant as much to women of color in terms of receiving suffrage as it did to white women. The next slide, please, Taylor. So when we use the previous photo, we also need to include this photo. This is a photo of Ida B. Wells Barnett, and she also marched in the parade. So what the previous photo does not show us is the heroism of Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was a member of the Alpha Suffrage Club of Chicago. And during that time, Illinois had an integrated delegation. But League leader Grace Trout acquiesced to the national leader's insistence that Blacks march together in the rear. Wells Barnett refused to do so. Two white women, Belle Squire and Virginia Brooks, came out of the crowd with her when the Illinois delegation passed and marched side by side with her in the parade. What is clear from that action is that to be a suffragist as a woman of color meant a series of compromises, collaboration, and controversy. So if we truly believe that in the history, everyone's story deserves to be told, we need to stop using the previous photo as the sole symbol of our efforts. It's important to acknowledge that people of color face unique challenges in the United States, and that women of color face those same challenges in the suffrage movement and subsequently the League of Women Voters. Women of color have a special place in women's studies because of intersectionality of gender and race. But this isn't about one moment that we need to recognize. It's about our history. The League is viewed as a microcosm of politically responsible and responsive women in American society, and that is all women. So how do we tell the full story? How do we acknowledge that there were strategic decisions and intentional efforts to marginalize the contributions of women of color, but through their passion, sense of purpose, and perseverance, along with their supporters, they made the League of Women Voters a better organization over the years. Taylor, the next slide, please. 2020. All right, how do we recognize the history of the moment without forgetting the stories of the movement that got us to this place? 2020 is going to be a watershed year for us, not just because of elections, but because of the census and our current situation. How do we face all of these new challenges? So 2 questions you can ask. How did we get here? Or here we go again. Either of those can be dealt with through the lessons we've learned in history. There was a recent editorial board article again in the New York Times. It's called The America We Need. And the editorial board said, and I quote, "The fragility of our society and government is the product of deliberative decisions. It may not feel like it now, but out of this crisis, there is a chance to build a better America." And I would say out of recognizing our history as a league, there is a chance for us to build a better organization. I'm encouraged that the leadership of the league is committed to getting this right for the next 100 years. And I am encouraged that state and local leagues are doing their own research and making sure that they include the conversations about women of color and their contributions in their commemorative celebrations. So as I structure the next remarks, it's going to be through the pillars of history. And there are 5 pillars of history: passion, purpose, perseverance, perspective, and power. And you will hear me talk about those as consistent themes. So the next slide, please, Taylor. Let's talk about passion. We know about the contributions of Ida B. Wells Barnett, who refused to march at the back of the suffrage parade. And we've heard Mary Church Terrell, who wrote A Colored Woman in a White World. And we know about Sojourner Truth, the premier abolitionist and women's rights activist. And we know about Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, president of the National Council of Negro Women. But what about the other women who participated in suffragist activities and league activities? We need to bring light to their faces. By showing their faces and connecting with them as people, we can truly understand their story. So Taylor, I'm gonna go quickly through the next few photos. So we know about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. We know about Addie Waits Hunton, and she had an interesting story because in 1921, at the first League convention in Cleveland, Addie Waits Hunton and a group of other women suffragists of color went to the League Executive Committee and wanted to present before convention a proposal for the League to prioritize the work needed to make sure that women of color would have the right to vote. Because, as I said earlier, 1920 did not necessarily give all women the right to vote. The executive leadership, the national executive leadership, decided that it would be too much of a disruption at convention if she, a colored woman, was allowed to speak before the body and make this proposal. They decided that rather than bring it before the convention floor, that they would, in good league fashion, issue a study. And so the special committee on the Negro problems was established. And Mrs. Hunton was informed of that decision by telegraph. The next slide. So we know Ida B. Wells Barnett, we know Mary Church Terrell. Nettie Helen Burroughs, who was also a suffragist, gave a speech entitled "How Sisters Are Hindered from Helping." The next slide. Anna Julia Cooper. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was on the previous slide. She was an abolitionist, suffragist, poet, teacher, public speaker, writer. Then there were the Fortin sisters, who were suffragists and abolitionists, and they co-founded the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society after being excluded from the American Anti-Slavery Society. And then there was Anna Julia Cooper. There was also, next slide, Taylor, Hetty Tilghman and Fanny Jackson Coppin and Helen Tillman. And then from Massachusetts, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. And I know that you are all familiar with that because in researching for tonight's remarks, I also ran across a series that the Randolph Women's Suffrage Coalition was doing, a film series that brought to light the contributions of women of color. So Massachusetts has a strong connection to women of color in the League of Women Voters, and also in the suffrage movement and in the League of Women Voters. The next slide, please. Okay, the League of Women Voters and other organizations need to tell these stories. And so we are moving to what is next is purpose. What is our purpose? In the next slide, you'll see that when we talk about purpose, we talk about how groups of women got together for a common vision and a common goal. The Executive Board of Rhode Island, this was the National Association of Colored Women, had an executive board in Rhode Island. The next slide, please. What this picture tells us is it doesn't matter what your race, women were active in making sure that women's rights were at the forefront of every conversation. Next picture, please. This is a group, the headquarters for the Colored Women Voters. It was based in Georgia. This photo challenges us to stop looking at the differences and look at similarities. You could easily substitute white women for the colored women in this picture and have the same conversation. These separate clubs became necessary as Black women began experiencing an anti-Black suffrage movement. Reportedly, the National Women's Suffrage Association considered the Northeastern Federation of Colored Women's Clubs to be a liability to the association due to Southern white women's attitudes toward Black women getting the vote. So much of the conversation was about Southern white women, but they were not solely to blame. There were many Northern white women who felt the same way. The next one, please. One of the most active organizations was the California Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. So when we talk about their role, the role of women of color in making sure that rights were obtained, we talk about perseverance. The next slide, please, Taylor. And one more. So one of the most interesting characters in the book is Delilah Beasley, and she has an interesting history. Delilah Beasley actually was referred to in a February 2020 New York Times article, and the title of the article was "The Pioneer Black Historian Who Was Almost Erased from History." So Delilah Beasley was from California. She spent her career working for the Oakland Tribune. She also taught history courses. She taught herself how to research, and she is known for writing a book called The Negro Trailblazers of California. Yet when we celebrated Black History Month and Women's History Month, most people had never heard of Delilah Beasley. In 1923, the Oakland Tribune started a new weekly column called Activities Among Negroes. And she used her voice to highlight the achievements of Black Californians and to support Black dignity and rights, raising awareness about barriers that existed for people of color and women, and to encourage interracial activities. She founded the Alameda County League of Women Voters. The reason that she had such interest to me was because of the conversations she had with the National League. During March of 1926, she wrote about 10 letters asking for guidance about how women of color could participate in the League of Women Voters. And she wanted to make sure that they were treated as actual members. So she had a battle on two fronts. Not only was she fighting with the leadership of the League, the quote white leagues, to not allow Black women in, but she also had a fight with Black women who did not want to be segregated. So I wanted to share with you part of a letter that she sent, and it gives you some understanding of what she was dealing with. So this letter was sent to the president of the National League, but ended up with Mrs. Warren Wheaton, who was the press secretary. And it says, "The state president of the California League has, through my assistance and that of my friends, finally succeeded in organizing in Los Angeles a colored unit of League of Women Voters. I would write you and ask you to write the president asking her to welcome us into the League. I've had a terrible time getting this League going. You see, there's a great deal of prejudice in this state toward our race, especially in Los Angeles. I have discovered that in cities where there are full colored leagues and not auxiliaries, the colored women develop leadership. Well, there's nothing in the League bylaws that allows for colored leagues. However, there were 3 colored leagues in California, one in Chicago, one in St. Louis, and one in Tacoma, Washington. Next slide, please. So the next few slides that Taylor's going to go through just show women actively engaged in making sure that over the years that voting was still a primary conversation. Then we get to perspective. The next slide, thanks. Next one. Thank you. Eleanor Roosevelt and Dr. Dorothy Height, 2 women whose conversations led to many changes. Eleanor Roosevelt, I don't know if many of you know, was not only former First Lady, but she was the Vice President for Legislative Policy, the League of Women Voters National Office. And during her time there, she wrote editorials to the New York Times calling the League on its hypocrisy. So in 1956, she wrote an editorial saying that the League needed to look inward and deal with its own issues of integration before it went into global conversations about what integration should look like. The next slide, please. Again, women were responsible. Women of color were always there when decisions were made. And it was not until the 1950s that they became visible, primarily because there were norms in society where women of color were not viewed or were not visible in news accounts other than through colored newspapers. And so the next slide, please. All right, so these 2 women, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune and Dr. Dorothy Height, were always active with the League. The League has always, however, had a transactional relationship with the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which later became the National Council of Negro Women. And by transactional, I mean that when the League needed access to certain communities and certain groups of people, they would then, in fact, call on colored women's clubs to help them. All of the records of convention indicate that a representative from the National Council of Negro Women was always invited as a guest. Dorothy Height, in an Ebony article in 1966, and this was one of the surprises that I found in my research, I did not know that Ebony magazine, which is the premier African-American magazine over the years until it went bankrupt, had done a 6-page article devoted to the League of Women Voters. And it surprised me on 2 fronts. First of all, because the League always claimed that it did not keep information on women of color or race. However, Ebony was able to find 20 women of color from across the nation to do their article on, so that was interesting to me. The second thing is that the article was included in with other groups, and the League was considered a mainstream group. So they also within that edition was the Black Panthers, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So organizations that would have been familiar to people of color, but the League of Women Voters was not. So one of the things that Dorothy Height said in the article, and she had been a League member for years, she said, "I've had a hard time persuading my friends to join the League. They can't see how working for a new state constitution, for instance, has much to do with the solutions to their problems." And so she felt that it was extremely difficult to do that. The article, if any of you have the opportunity to find it, and it is my understanding that Ebony's archives now will be going to the National African American Museum, so that will give us some more resources to work from. But the article spotlighted 20 women of color from across the nation, from New Jersey, from New York, from Hawaii, Louisiana, Michigan, West Virginia, Washington, D.C., Florida, Indiana, Illinois, North Carolina, Rhode Island, Missouri, Iowa, and Georgia. One of the most compelling interviews in that article was from Mrs. Dora Needham, who at the time in 1966 was 85 years old. And she talked about how she was a suffragist and didn't initially join the League, but joined the League in 1948. Okay, next slide, Taylor. Now let's talk about power. Shirley Chisholm. And I don't think many people don't realize that Shirley Chisholm was an active League member. The next slide. Barbara Jordan worked very closely with the League. And one of the quote that is there for you to see is one of my favorite quotes from her. A nation is formed by the willingness of each of us to share in the responsibility for upholding the common good. Her remarks were grounded in her historic experience. She was the first African-American elected to the Texas Senate after Reconstruction in 1966, and the first Southern African-American woman elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1972. In 1976, her Democratic National Convention keynote address was one of the best that history records. And her commencement address at Harvard University in June of 1977 said, "What people want is simple. They want an America as good as its promise." Next slide, please. This is the America that we're talking about. This is the organization that we're talking about, and the League must represent all of these people. The next slide, please. Look at the increase in the women of Congress. When we talk about power, there's our power base. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit. I want to give you some overview about the structure and the focus of the book. Writing this book was cathartic for me, and it was a labor of love, but it was cathartic because I knew intuitively that there had to have been women of color who participated and contributed. But I could not find a lot of mention of them other than in the footnotes of League history. And to me, that was not where I wanted to leave them. And because I have the platform now to talk about their contributions, I would be irresponsible if I did not do so. So one of my favorite quotes, I begin each chapter with one of my favorite quotes, and that quote sets the tone for what the chapter will be about. One of my favorite quotes is from Martin Luther King Jr., and it says, "In the end, we will remember not the voices of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." So, as I asked at the beginning, why this story and why now? Because we have a unique opportunity to look at the lessons learned and to make sure that as we move into the next 100 years, we are truly representative of the women who we claim to be representative of. This book discusses the origin and the evolution of the League's attitude that's reflected in its policies and practices. And as I said earlier, I focused only on national perspective because to focus on state and local league perspective would take another 100 years. What I try to do is present an accurate and respectful record of the strategic choices that the organization made. I need to say that this is not a revisionist history, and it's not an attempt to rewrite history. It's an effort to make sure that we have a comprehensive history and that the stories we tell are the true stories that should be told. It is true that the League's history marginalized the contributions of women of color in its first 100 years, as did the organization in many instances. So telling this story now obliges the organization to take a candid look at itself and do better. Our past does not have to define our future. Even though it is a predictor, it does not have to be a determinant because we have a choice. The historians who talk about the women's movement did little research on the League as an independent organization. And one of the surprises for me in researching was that there are not a lot of intentional record keeping that took place. So what was filed was what we could find. And unfortunately, the League has never had a historian or archivist on staff or full-time. And so the records that are there are not categorized in any particular way other than the Special Committee on Negro Problems. Those have their own file and they are categorized in a way that is logical. But oftentimes in organizations such as the League, when people leave, whatever is in their desk is tossed. And so that is true with the League. And so there are gaps in the information that I've provided in the book. There are many instances where I raise conversations, and you can see from the actual primary documents that the leaders engage in these conversations. Sometimes they ignored them, and sometimes they just remained silent on the issues. What is also interesting is that other than the actual documents that are in public domain, you will not see documents in their entirety, because in order to include them in their entirety, I would have had to get permission from estates and from other people. So I am looking forward to the time when more and more of our documents come into public domain so that they can be published in their entirety. By reading the documents and seeing the kinds of conversations that were held, you get a better feel of the decisions that were made. And decisions were made with the information that was known at the time. So the book is structured to show the progression of the relationship between the League and its members of color through the changes in its policies, practices, symbols, and messages. And one of the things that I find encouraging is that the photo that is on the book cover is also the photo that is currently used for the membership recruitment brochures. The League did not start using people of color in any of its images until the late 1960s. And so it's important that we are aware when we start promoting things that we are inclusive about our images. So the chapter titles were ideological more than chronological. For instance, chapter 1, Lest We Forget. I wanted to remind us that we cannot forget our past, because it does influence our future. And so that first chapter, I synthesize all of the existing histories of the League. The second chapter, To Finish the Fight, we all know that was Carrie, Chapman, Catt's mantra that we picked up. We need to finish the fight. And I would argue that the fight is not finished. The fight was not finished in 1920 because women of color really didn't have full suffrage. The third chapter, For the Sake of the Cause. Why would women of color want to be affiliated with an organization that discouraged them from joining? And so in that chapter, I look at the paradox of the organization's attempt to reconcile changes in society and changes in the organization, and how every time we restructured, we did not really address the issue of race. So through Amber, I'm sorry, Taylor, I forgot to tell you to advance, but you picked up on it. Okay, so Through Amber Colored Glasses is a tale, I call it a tale of two realities, because most of the time we want to see ourselves through rose-colored glasses. But for women of color, amber-colored glasses were the way that we had to look, because there was nothing that occurred for us that was not through the lens of race. The Weight of History talks about my experience as the first and only in the first 100 years president of color. And then The Unfinished Fight gives us an opportunity to look forward to what our future can be. So when we talk about history, we talk about our stories. And our stories for the first 100 years have to be different for the second 100 years. And I always think about here's what, so what, now what. The first 100 years of the League of Women Voters, the stories that we've chosen to this point have marginalized the contributions of women of color in the League's achievements, images, symbols, and messaging. So what? So to discount it or relegate to footnotes the significant contributions of these women is contradictory to the League's mission, vision, and principles. And now what? Let's use the 100th anniversary recognition activities and events as an opportunity to represent the League in all of its dimensions, the good, the bad, the ugly, and use the lessons learned to chart a path for the organization to do better. And if you could just move to the slide with the hashtags. Okay, so I'm going to conclude. Because I know that many of you have questions. So I'm going to stop by saying we should leave nothing to chance. And for those of you who are social media savvy, I did some hashtags for you. We were there too. Women of color were there at the very beginning and throughout, and should have the recognition that they deserve. Rhetoric or reality, we can talk a lot about what happens, but it is our actions that show who we really are. We make strategic choices. We have a sense of hope. We need to do the right thing. There's a fragile balance that occurs that we have to address. This is a new day. We have to believe. We have the promise of a new order. I too am the League. We've been here before, finding purpose, hope, promise, and possibilities. So with that information, and I know it's like drinking from a fire hose and there's so much more that I could say, but let's just go ahead and move to questions now, because the richness of the conversation is in the questions that people have posed for me to respond to.
Well, I think I speak for everyone, Dr. Jefferson-Jenkins, when I say thank you so much for all of that information. It was really wonderful. The first question is rather long, but I'm going to start with this one. So the question is, in Rosalind Turberg Penn's book, African American Women and the Struggle for the Vote, 1850 to 1920, she depicts the erasure of African American women's contributions to obtaining universal suffrage as being quite intentional on the part of Susan B. Anthony and many other white women in the suffrage movement. Which seems to be much more pernicious than what you had said about it being more of an omission. What is your view about that?
Okay, so it was very intentional and strategic, and in the book, that is exactly what I say. It was intentional and it was strategic, and I did not mean to overlook it or marginalize it myself in these comments. The other person that is called to task in the book is Carrie Chapman Catt, and when the University of Iowa wanted to devote a statue to her, we had a long discussion at the national leadership about whether or not we should attend because of her racist remarks. So in the book, I do speak to the racism that existed, the intentional and strategic decisions that were made that marginalized or totally made invisible any contribution of women, and the fact that after 1920, when the League had the opportunity to use the momentum to make sure that women of color had the right to vote, they chose not to. Next question.
Yeah. The next question is, was Barbara Jordan actually a League member?
Yes.
Okay. And someone wanted to know what year was the Ebony article?
Was the
Ebony article?
1966, October 1966.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through here. Next question. Did Alice Paul ever apologize to Ida B. Wells for prohibiting her from marching in the 1913 parade in Washington, D.C.?
I did not find evidence of that, but what is interesting is if you've ever seen the film Iron-Jawed Angels, in that film, there's a misrepresentation of history, because in that film, they show Alice Paul coming out to hug Ida B. Wells Barnett as if she was welcoming her to that. And that is historically accurate. And when I questioned that in the film, what they told me was that it's a film and not a documentary. And that has stuck with me.
Yeah. Another question that we have, and this is one actually that I was thinking of myself, was how can we recruit more Black women today? The League of Women Voters in Pennsylvania, this is from someone in that league. In my experience, unfortunately, they're very white and undiverse. How have you encouraged Black women, for instance, to get involved with the league?
Okay, so there are two levels to my answer. The first, whenever I'm asked how can we recruit more Black women, I said that's where you make your mistake. You're not recruiting them because they're Black women. You're recruiting them because you agree on issues. The league is seen as a conduit to getting something done, or the league has access that I may not have in other organizations. But I don't want to be your project. I don't want to be a quota. I want to be valued for what I bring to the table. And so you have to make an investment in people. You have to broaden your sphere of influence. We tend to recruit from friends or people who we surround ourselves with. And so my advice is start surrounding yourself with other people. Go to events that you normally wouldn't go to and show an interest. Don't go there hoping to recruit somebody. Go there to show an interest and to show the similarities in what you're hoping to accomplish. The second, I lost my train of thought on the second. Can you read the question to me one more time? The second part?
Yeah, hold on, sorry. How have you encouraged Black women, for instance, to get involved in the league?
Okay, so yeah, and one of the interesting things, and I go back to the 1966 Ebony article, there are benefits to being in the league. There are access points that the league has because of its credibility and history and integrity that other organizations may not have. There are opportunities for Black women to contribute and move their own agendas within the league. And I always tell people, you've got to make the league work for you, because when we talk about transactional relationships, it's not just what the league can get from you, it's what can you get from the league. And I think that mirrors what Dr. Haidt was saying when she told her friends that, league provides you with access that you wouldn't normally have. It provides you with an opportunity to be recognized in circles that you may not have been recognized in before. And so find the benefit for what you want to accomplish and make it work for you.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have, switching gears a little bit here. Can you comment on the effect of the presence of the squad on Black women as voters in our current election cycle?
Short answer, no.
Okay.
I think I don't want us to generalize. I don't want us to put people in a box. I don't want us to take ideologies and generalize them to groups of people. I think anybody who motivates someone to engage in the political process, I'm for. And so because the league is nonpartisan, I'm nonpartisan, I want people engaged in the process. I want people participating in the process. I want people informed about the process. Doesn't matter to me who does that.
Yeah. Next, this is a question. Which of the prominent suffrage leaders did push for equity? Can you comment on that?
They all did when it was convenient for them to do so. It was not consistent. So even Carrie, Chapman, Catt, when it was convenient for them, and it was, again, a transactional relationship, when it was to their benefit to do so, they pushed for it. When it was not to their benefit to do so, they didn't. And that's the nature of who they were as people. Their goal was to get the vote for, they said all women, but really it was for white women, because they didn't take up the cause for Black women afterwards.
This is more of a personal question in terms of your personal experience. What do you think most characterized your tenure as the first and only African-American League of Women Voters president? Was it your race, the issues at the time, or something else?
Something else. It's interesting that race became an issue because one of the things that I always share is I don't have to tell you I'm Black. That just happens. And so one of the questions that I was always asked is, what is it like to be the first African-American president? I said, I'm league president because I've toiled in the league for years at every level. The fact that I'm Black is a bonus because I bring different perspectives to the conversation. But I always think of Elizabeth Warren said something when she got out of the presidential race that resonated with me because when people ask me, was race a factor? It's like, it's as complicated as the league's history is complicated with its members of color. But one of the things she said that resonated was when somebody asked her, was it about gender? And she said, if I say it's about gender, you'll say I'm whining. If I don't say it's about gender, you'll say, what planet am I coming from? So I use the same conversation about race. If I say race was a factor, there are a group of people who say I'm whining. If I don't say race was a factor, there are a group of people who say, what planet do you live on? So it's a complicated response that needs to be given. So I'm noted for bringing the league into kicking and screaming, I always say, into the 21st century. When I first joined the board, everybody had to have a fax machine. And that was our technology. So we were able to computerize things. We were able to start the Wired for Democracy program, which led to DNET, which ultimately led to Vote 411. We were able to increase our diversity with our State Department funded programs to expand to 8 African countries and South American countries where previously we had focused primarily in Eastern European countries. So there were a number of things that happened as a result of my presidency. We were able to also partner with organizations that normally we didn't partner with. And so the league's scope of influence increased exponentially in those areas. So there are a lot of things that I am proud of, but what I'm most proud of now is the fact that I'm able to tell the story of those women upon whose shoulders I stand.
Yeah. I think we have maybe time for a couple more. Once the 19th Amendment was passed, did Black women experience the same or greater discrimination as Black men regarding voting?
Depended on where it was regionally. In many of the southern states, because of Jim Crow laws, Black women, of course, experienced the same kinds of obstacles and barriers that Black men did. People often think that because they were female, that they weren't treated as harshly, and that's not true. So there still was the opportunity for job loss. There was the opportunity for physical harm. There was the opportunity to lose your property. And so women and men were both challenged by what was going on with Jim Crow. And I often think people forget that there were still Jim Crow, while there might not have been codified Jim Crow laws, there were still Jim Crow activities occurring in northern and western states as well as southern states.
Yeah. This is someone, Dr. Jefferson-Jenkins, who is a woman of color involved in the league. And she wants to know, as a woman of color, what attracted you to the league given its history? And she also says she's constantly being asked about the value of joining the league and, why is she in the league? And I think, as an executive director of a state league, that's a question I would like to hear about too. I think that's really important. So
what is interesting is that, and I'll tell you my story about why I joined the league and then the challenges of being a woman of color in the league. So I was a many of you know I'm an educator, so I was a social studies teacher, and the league was hosting presidential debates in Cleveland. And as a good social studies teacher that I was, I wanted to have tickets to go to the presidential debate, but I was informed by the league that the tickets would only go to league members. So I wrote a check and joined the league. And as a result, they started sending me the voter, and I found out when the meetings were, so I showed up at the meetings. And I always say, be careful who you open your doors to. So one of the recruitment techniques of DEI is that people have to be invited. I was not invited. I invited myself and stuck around for 40 plus years. But there are some unique challenges. I had the opportunity to talk to Josie Johnson, Dr. Josie Johnson, who was the first Black national board member. And I also had the opportunity to talk to Mildred Madison, who was my mentor, and they both joined the league in the 40s. And so my question to Dr. Johnson was, you know, did you feel pressure to be the spokesperson for all people of color? And that's a burden that is put on us by other people. So while you go in and you know that you're valuable and you know what you bring to the table, two things happen. You're always being forced to prove that you belong there. And you're always viewed as the person who speaks the issues for the race. And that is unfair expectations being placed on people that are not placed on other people. And so you have to learn to deal with that. And as I always say, make the league work for you. So one of the things that I did when I first joined was I brought in some of my friends of color so that I was not the only person of color. I was not the only young person there. And so you've got to make it work for you. But I know that it gets tiring to always have to prove that you belong or to prove that you're capable. And so in the book, what is interesting is when even as late as 1953, when people were told there was a membership recruitment drive, and the reason that they didn't want colored women in the league was because they weren't intelligent enough, and they had to be taught, or they couldn't respond to the league way. And so all of those things are in the book, and we've got to move beyond that as we move into this next 100 years.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, Dr. Jefferson-Jenkins, a woman of color from the Pennsylvania League, she's asking, how do you suggest opening up the consciousness of white league members who don't fully understand diversity and inclusivity?
So all right, so in addition to the cultural competence training that needs to happen and the diversity training that needs to happen, take them with you to other places. When I was league president, I made it known that I would not speak if I walked into a room and I was the only person of color. So that forced leagues to look at sororities and community-based organizations and other organizations and invite those people from those organizations to league events. But we can't just invite people to league events. We've got to get out there and go. League members have to go to other people's events and show that they're interested. And we don't do it. It's become a one-way street. We want people to come to us. And that's not going to happen. So in order to invite your colleagues or league colleagues to some event that they normally wouldn't go to, and have them look at the similarities and not the differences. Because right now, we all want the same thing. I'm encouraged by the kindness and the commercials and all the way that people are banding together, showing their similarities and not their differences. But it's not easy. I am not in any way, shape, or form saying it's an easy task to do. It's got to be done incrementally, because if you pull people along too fast, you lose them. And so there are strategies in the DEI materials. There are strategies in cultural competence that you can research and pull from the internet, but you've got to take people to meet other people beyond their sphere of influence.
Yeah. Switching now to sort of beyond the league, the question is, what do you see as a couple of the greatest challenges that women of color face in terms of getting them to engage in voting? And what would you suggest to motivate more to register and vote, especially with the events that have worked against voters in Georgia and other states?
Okay, so challenges, I don't know that I could identify any particular challenge, but one of the challenges that sticks out to me is the fact that if you don't see yourself, a reflection of yourself in a leadership position, in a political position, you don't aspire to that. And we are in a situation currently where if you look at people who are making decisions, they're all white, and many white men. If you look at the candidates for the presidential candidates, we've narrowed to white men. And so that causes people sometimes to disengage because they don't see themselves there. What people need to understand is that by not participating, you are giving your voice to somebody else. And it is important that not only that we register, but that we vote, not just in presidential elections, which is where a lot of the conversation is, but in the down ballot elections, that school board, county commissioner, your mayor, your governor, those are the people who make the decisions that are closest to you. And in order to have a voice and to have people respond to what it is that you need, you have got to be engaged in the process.
Yeah. All right, so I think maybe this will be the last question. It's a little bit of a repeat, but the question is, as a woman of color, how can I help to bring the league to a place where other women of color want to join?
Okay, so by showing the benefits to them of joining the league. So one of the things that and I keep going back to this 1966 article because what these women said is still relevant today, and it was so poignant. By showing women of color that by being a member of the league, you have access that you may not have otherwise. And that access puts you in a position to do things that you may not normally do. And it doesn't mean it's an either or proposition. One of the things that you'll read in the book is that there was always a relationship between the National Council of Negro Women and the League of Women Voters. And it was a transactional relationship, but both groups gained something from that. One of the people who was interviewed in the Ebony article indicated that because she became a league member, she then was appointed to a county commissioner seat that she would not have gotten had she not been a league member, and they recognized her as a league member. So there are some advantages to being in the League of Women Voters. And what you need to do is look at your league, look at the access that they have to groups, look at the projects that they're working on, and insert yourself in a leadership position in those things that make sense for you.
Well, that is the end of the questions. And I'm just going to turn it over to Judy to close out.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jefferson-Jenkins. It was a very informative, valuable, it's just great. So thank you so much. And certainly, I've been reading through the comments and the questions and answers, a lot of very lively discussion ideas beyond what we were able to ask. And I hope that everyone who is on the webinar, you certainly take these ideas back to your local league, your state leagues, and what we want to do is start thinking about how do we work towards our next 100 years to really meet the what we can do as a league, which is to be inclusive in the mission that we're seeking to deliver. So thank you so very much. One of the questions that did come up is the two things actually. We have the webinar taped. We will post it on League of Women Vote Massachusetts website. That's lwvma.org. So once we get that up, we will be able to access it there. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you can purchase Dr. Jefferson-Jenkins' book through Amazon. Is that correct?
Right. There's if Taylor, you can go to the very last slide. It has keep going. Sorry, you're gonna have to go again. One more time. One more time. There you go.
So there's the information for both the Amazon for other information and also contact information for Dr. Jefferson-Jenkins if you'd like to follow up with. I assume that's okay.
It is okay. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. So again, thank everyone for attending. I'd like to put in a plug for our next webinar in our series. It'll be held on June 2nd, which is a Tuesday at 7 p.m. And author Barbara Berenson, who is a Massachusetts resident who has been researching the women's suffrage unit movement, and she's going to be talking about after suffrage, the campaign for Equal Rights Amendment 1920 to 2020. And if you're interested in attending, you can register at our website, which again is lwvma.org. And again, I'd like to thank everyone. I'd like to thank Patty, Bryn, and Taylor for making this a reality, and also for Karen Price. Thank you.
And thank you, Judy.
Good night, everyone.